None of us are smarter than all of us. I learned that hard work always wins if talent doesn't work hard. That's what I really learned from after-school programs. And like you, what I learned, I use every day in my life and my career. Now, how many of you participated in after-school programs? And I'm defining after-school programs as things outside of the normal school day, including weekends and summers. And most of you, I would bet, did it for free, right? Because that was a part of our system of how we supported kids. We had after-school programs and youth development opportunities that were available to our children. And the reason that we had them available was because we believed that was our community's responsibility. Today, we know that child poverty is growing in our state, that our kids in this state need these extra supports more than ever. Yet we as a state put very little resources into it. Quite honestly, the majority of what we put into the issue of after-school program comes from our federal government. And those dollars are always on the chopping block. So it's time for us to resolve this issue. It's unfortunate that our kids, literally, in order for them to participate in after-school program, that they have to pay to play, figuratively and literally. And if any of you have had a child play AAU sports, you probably had to take out a second mortgage. When we look at the data, we know a couple of things, that middle-class kids and higher income kids sometimes have 3,000 hours more of after-school programming than kids that live in poor neighborhoods. So we have to figure out how to solve this equation. And there are communities literally all over the country who are solving this question. And I think that we, this great state of Michigan, can solve that question too. So I am really excited for you to have our panelists, hear our panelists, and to talk about this issue, about how we make sure our kids get what they need from the cradle all the way up to career. And I'm so grateful that our colleagues at Kellogg and Kresge talked about early childhood, which is an important part of that pipeline of services we have for kids. So let's get started.
Please welcome President and Chief Executive Officer of the Forum for Youth Investment, Karen J. Pittman. Joining Karen Pittman on stage is President.
I get 20 whole minutes to talk to you before we get some colleagues joining us up here. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to make sure that in the limited amount of time that I have, that I set you up with some ideas. So the Forum for Youth Investment is based in Washington, D.C., but half of our organization is actually here in Michigan. The Weichert Center for Youth Program Quality is down in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and is a part of the High Scope Educational Research Foundation legacy. And I was actually I was one of the first camp counselors at High Scope Educational Camp for Teenagers, if anybody is old enough to remember when that was around. Why we're talking about after school today is, as Tonya just said, an important part of what we need to know in order to change the odds for young people. This is about improving opportunities to get to improved outcomes. And I want to talk to you for a minute about why I use the word changing the odds. Because right now in our country, we have to move from talking about equality and talking about access and talking about completion to using a bolder set of words. We have to talk about equity. We have to talk about quality, which Tonya just mentioned. Access isn't enough. It's first, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And we really do have to talk about readiness if we're going to make sure that our young people are ready for post-secondary education, whatever path that is, ready for work and ready for life. So we have a bolder set of goals, and to do that, to really change the odds for young people, we have to figure out how to move those three words forward. So let me talk first about what the odds are, because we can't change the odds if we don't know what they are. I want to share with you a piece of wonky research that I think is very powerful. It was done by the Brookings Institute. It's called the Social Genome Project. Huge process to sort of develop this modeling system that had thousands of sort of individual pathways from birth all the way through to age 30 or age 35 that they pieced together from big data sets. The reason they did this was they wanted to ask the question, what does it take for every young person, even if they're born in poverty, to be middle class by middle age? We can come back to quibble over how they define middle class, but this is what the study did. What they found was that there are some basic determinants of what it takes for young people to be on track. And I'm not going to read them to you, they're on your screens. These are not surprising. They basically speak to the idea that young people have to have some basic educational foundation, and they also have to have social skills and social competencies. They build those early, and those really help them essentially not get into trouble later on, to stay on track. What they found, if you want to be glass half full, is that at every developmental stage, about 2/3 of young people are on track, and about 1/3 are off track. What they found, not surprisingly, is that when you break that down by race, and when you break that down by income, young people who are young people of color, young people who are coming from more disadvantaged families, are less likely at every developmental stage to be on track. And the gaps get bigger as young people get older. We've done our best to keep young people on track in early childhood. But what I want you to understand is the story of the movement behind that data. So we take those ideas of what it means to be on track at every developmental stage, we turn the data sideways, and we say, all right, I'm reinforcing this idea that about 2/3 are on track and 1/3 are off track, give or take 40% at every developmental stage. Here's what you need to know. Nobody stays on track. At every developmental stage, young people fall off, right? We don't have a 100% guarantee that if you're on track in one stage, you move naturally to be on track in the next stage. Good news, the same is true for being off track. Being off track is not a life sentence. If you're off track, you can get back on track. So there is movement, significant movement across both. Why is that movement important for you to know? Often because when we think about social policies, we think about moving young people, getting programs to get kids off track, back on track, especially when we're thinking about adolescence. We think less about what it takes to have young people who are on track stay on track. And when you go into programs and you talk to kids, you actually know that sometimes that line is a fine line. I can be on track, and something happens in my family, something happens in life, and I start to slide off track. One of the things that you probably remember, since I know a lot of you put your hands up when you said, did you participate in after-school programs? Because these programs tend to start with relationship building, they are much more likely to know when young people are moving off track. And so we want to make sure they have the ability to help young people not slip, as well as have the ability to work with young people through relationship building and skill building to help them get on track. They play a role with both of those arrows. I just had the pleasure of being a part of this 2-year commission called the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development that came out with a bunch of bold conclusions. One of their conclusions was that we are in a unique time, and I really do believe this. We often say we're in a unique time, but I really do believe we're in a unique time in which state and local policymakers have an opportunity to prioritize the whole learner. And we can do this especially because of the shift in state and local authority over education, and I want you to read that as education broadly defined. Not just K-12, but what we can do to really make sure our young people are learning in all the places where they spend time. Why this is important is that what the commission has done is to really sort of reinforce the work that was done a couple of decades ago, 2002, community programs to promote youth development. We had the National Research Council, a part of the National Academy of Sciences, tell us what it takes to create good learning environments for kids. I won't go into the details, but trust me, huge important piece. It gave folks in the after-school and youth development space a roadmap for saying this is what quality programs look like, and this is why they're important. This Nation of Hope came back to reinforce that, and it basically told us young people need to build social skills and competencies, they need to build emotional skills and competencies, they need to build cognitive skills and competencies. We often call those executive function, if you all know that language. All of those skills need to be built. All of those skills can be built throughout all of those years, from early childhood up to young adulthood. and we do that through programming. I like this slide a lot because it speaks in plain English. We spend a lot of time debating whether we want to call it social emotional learning, social emotional academic development, 21st century skills, life skills, soft skills. The point is, when you ask families, what are the skills and competencies that you want your young people to have, they can name them. Young people can name them. Employers can name them. That list are the things that we're looking to build. Yes, schools absolutely build this, but the more we have learning environments in which young people have the flexibility of picking what they want to focus on, what they want to master, what they want to explore, so that they have opportunities to use and practice these skills, get rewarded for these skills, have these skills named, and use them to good end, the more we are contributing to our future workforce and to our future citizens. So families have named what it is that they want young people to build, and when they go out to look for programs for their kids, they're often looking for programs that are building these skills. The other thing is that when we ask families, what do you want to call them? They said, just keep it simple and call them life skills. The rest of the stuff is too complicated. There is a demand. This is from the commission. We know teachers believe these skills are important. We know, as I just showed you, parents believe these skills are important, and that schools and non-school settings have a role in reinforcing the development of these skills. We know that students think these skills are important and that they think we don't spend enough time reinforcing them. And we know, which is really important, that 8 out of 10 employers think these skills are the most important for success. And we have lots of surveys that suggest that employers think high school graduates, so we focus on the idea of completion, but they say 4 out of 10 high school graduates are not ready to take their entry-level jobs because they lack these skills. So let's talk a little bit about what it takes to create equitable learning opportunities for young people. And let's talk about the power of settings. Now, you're all going to recognize this as a young person probably walking into a school, right? When that young person walks into school, they're not walking into one setting. They're walking into a setting in which there are many, many more doors. And every one of those doors can be a different learning environment. If I open up the cafeteria, that may be a hostile environment. I open up my math class, I may not be doing well in math. I open up the door to my art class, I love my art teacher. I really perform and use all those skills in that class. I participate in sports after school or an extracurricular club. That's another opportunity. So when we think about even that setting called school, we need to break it down and understand the multiple opportunities there are for young people to name, practice, and use these skills, not just in the context of academics. What we know from the science of learning and development, is that we can create the conditions of learning anywhere by using these 5 principles. First, we lead with relationships. Second, we create environments in which young people have a strong sense of belonging. Third, we pour in rich instructional experiences. That could be algebra, that could be car mechanics, that could be whatever we want. We pour in rich instructional experiences that challenge young people. Then we make sure we're providing individualized supports. Because we have those relationships that we're building with young people, we have an opportunity to see if they're learning, to monitor their experience, and to make adjustments. And then we are intentional about developing those critical skills that young people need to have, those skill sets, those mindsets, those habits. We're helping them develop them. Sometimes they're doing explicit teaching, but we're really doing more than that. The National Commission sort of put out this idea, which was very important. They had a distinguished group of educators from frontline teachers up to state superintendents who came back to reinforce what we know. But it was a big deal for them, and so I just want to share it quickly. Basically, we understand that learning happens in settings, right? We understand that, let me back up for a second. We understand that learning happens in settings, that influences the student's experience, and that leads to student outcomes. I put this up because we often skip over the student experience piece, and we just say, if we've created the place where learning is supposed to happen, all we have to do is wait and measure to see if the outcomes come out. What the science of learning tells us is that we have to focus on that middle space, that we don't know that we've created settings for learning until we've actually looked at young people's experiences and asked them, are you learning? Are you comfortable? Are you feeling safe and supported? Are you challenged? So, life skills are built in quality learning environments. They start with young people having a definition of success, which is about giving them a sense of agency, giving them a sense of identity, and making sure they have a broad set of competencies, academic, social, civic, emotional, et cetera. They're building those mindsets and skill sets. They're creating a sense of values, not just from their school and their communities, but clearly from their families. And they're developing a sense of self-regulation. The idea is that all of this happens because young people have a chance to act and reflect. Act and reflect. That's the measure of what we're looking for in any learning environment that we go into. If you stand in the back of the room, if you watch a video, and I ask you to grade that video, inevitably you're going to grade it higher if you see opportunities for young people to do the words going around that little yin-yang picture. They're acting and they're reflecting. And what the research tells us is it's both. If we don't give them time to reflect, they don't know those skills are important. Act and reflect. As Tonya mentioned, after school, summer, weekend opportunities, opportunities inside a school in those spaces that we don't count because they're not the official places where math and science are being taught, are all opportunities where young people can be learning and practicing this broader set of skills that are so important for life readiness and for workforce readiness, but young people don't have equal opportunities to do it. Too many young people are waiting, and those are young people who are from lower income families. Those are from young people whose communities don't have natural access to these programs, and they're from disproportionately young people of color. This doesn't mean that we don't have good things out there. It just means that we need more, that we need to scale. We need to look at what we have and make it happen. Why is this important? I know you're worried about academic success, as you should be. I want to remind you that building these basic environments in which young people feel safe and supportive, that are relationship-driven, that are giving them opportunities for choice, and doing all the things that we would call sort of positive youth development, it makes a difference. This is a quick slide showing you, done by the Weichert Center down the road. Let's look at programs. These are summer programs for young people who were behind in math and reading. And so they were being taught math and reading, but they were being taught math and reading combined with a positive youth program. The programs that had created a high-quality learning environment, like what I just described, got significantly higher gains in math and reading than the programs that didn't, right? And again, a reminder that definition of quality was about the quality of the learning setting. Again, I won't read you the list because we're running out of time. So my conclusion and my suggestion for you is that we need to, as communities, you need to, in Michigan, acknowledge the contributions and the progress that you already made in broadening the definition of where and when learning happens. In schools and out of schools, in the summer and during the school year, on the weekends. We can broaden the definition of where learning happens. And again, when we say in schools, we've got important community partners like Playworks coming into your schools during the school day, using that dead time called recess to help young people build these skills. This isn't a school out of school. It's really taking full advantage of naming all the settings where learning could happen and maximizing those settings. The SEED Commission recommends that we have a clear vision of a whole learner, the whole child, that we look at this broad array of learning settings, that we focus on social, emotional, and cognitive skills, that we actually build more adult expertise in child development, not just content, but in child development, that we align these resources across these system lines, and that we really bring our research into practice more forcefully. And under every one of those recommendations, there's a clear message about what we need to do for after school and community partners. So I'm going to leave you with this basic idea that from an equity perspective, it's important to acknowledge all the barriers that young people have. The playing field is not level. The structural barriers are not even for young people. We need to create opportunities by taking down the fences, and blurring the lines between school and after school is one way to take down those fences. But reducing the barriers isn't enough. We have to really have a strong definition of readiness that involves this broader set of competencies so that our young people aren't just watching the game, they're in the game. So thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to invite I won't invite our folks up, the voice.
Joining Karen Pittman on stage is President and Chief Executive Officer of Michigan's Children and former state representative, Matt Gillard. And President and Chief Executive Officer of United Way for Southeastern Michigan, Darienne Driver Hudson.
Great. We're ready.
All right.
Okay, so Matt, let's start with you.
Sure.
So I know that you're thinking a lot about after school, and one of the things that I assume that you are passionate about is that we want to remind people that after school is not a partisan issue. It really is a children's issue. So as you think from your state perspective, do you feel that we're really giving enough attention to after school, both as policymakers, as business leaders? Where do you think we stand?
No, I don't, not at all. I mean, certainly from the policymaker standpoint, Michigan as a state invests essentially $0 into dedicated after-school funding. We receive about $38 million every year from the federal government to run our 21st Century Community Learning Center program. These are great programs. We serve about, I think, 260 sites, 259 sites in last year, about 30,000 kids, about 68 grantees. The federal government sets the parameters for being eligible to apply. There's demographic factors and others. This program is geared towards populations where the need is greatest, and this is a great program. Michigan State University evaluates this program annually. The extensive evaluation shows great results. We see summer learning gains rather than summer learning loss, particularly around literacy and other issues from students who access these programs. But the problem is it's not enough. We have roughly twice as many qualified applicants as we have funding available for them. So we get about $80 million in qualified applications for funding for this program every year. We have about $38 million to spend from the federal government. This program is administered through the Michigan Department of Education. The administration is set up. What we're advocating for at Michigan's Children is state investment to match that, to supplement the federal funding that we're getting. We know that the need is out there. Karen identified in her slides that the need is out there. We know the state has done a good job of state investment into pre-K. We recognize that there was a need for providing pre-K opportunities to children who otherwise weren't getting access to high-quality pre-K. We see this as an insurance policy on that pre-K investment. These same kids, once they start elementary school and once they matriculate through the K-12 system, need additional resources that my kids and your kids are getting in the summertime and out of school time hours. And so we think there's a real opportunity here for the state to make this a priority. I'll tell you, as a former legislator, I know how difficult this is. I chaired the school aid budget during my time in the legislature, and thinking that we can just find $35 million and create a new categorical in the budget to fund this is a tall order. Luckily, I think we have a real opportunity right now in front of us to identify a dedicated funding stream. There was a Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago, year and a half ago, that allows states to authorize and regulate online sports gambling. There's legislation moving through the legislature right now to do this in Michigan. A number of other states have already done this. This is gambling that's already happening. It's happening here in Michigan. We're not creating new gambling opportunities. It's just an opportunity for the state to regulate it and to frankly make some money off of it. This is legislation that I think is going to pass. The legislature and the administration is going to decide where those funds go. Those funds could go into the general fund to fill a few potholes, right? And maybe take a fraction of a percentage off of what's needed for road funding. They could go into the school aid fund and continue with the fight that we have every year over where school aid fund dollars go or how many we need. Or we could dedicate it to something like after school funding. I think there's a real connection to be made. The industry that we're going to be making, these funds generally are going to be made off of, are the professional sports teams. The National Football League, for one, is a huge supporter of after school programs around the country. We happen to have two prominent families in Southeast Michigan with real connections to the National Football League and the Wilsons and the Fords. But the NBA, the NHL, the MLB are all real supportive of after-school programs. We think it makes a lot of sense to look at that as a dedicated funding stream to create a 21st century model. The administration's already set up. To us, this is a no-brainer, and I think a real opportunity.
That's amazing. So this idea of you've invested early, and now we want to sustain that investment, and a huge amount of research that says we really do need to sustain that investment or they slip backwards.
Absolutely, and it's the same population of children that we're talking about as they move through.
That's great. That's great. So Dr. Hudson, you've been in this for, I won't say a long time, but you've been in this for a sufficient amount of time, wearing multiple hats as both a superintendent and now as a nonprofit leader. Where do you see opportunities for schools and communities to partner, community organizations to partner?
So the example that resonates the most, and I think would resonate with a lot of people in the room, I got my start as a 4th grade teacher in Detroit Public Schools. And we were at the intersection where 6 Mile and Brush meet. And there were a lot of people that thought, and now our school is closed, so there was an assumption that our children could not. But we were able to partner with the Detroit Police Athletic League. We started a basketball program, and I was the cheerleading coach. And who knew something as simple as cheerleading could help bring inspiration, nurturing, safety, hope, and education to a community that deserved it and also needed it. And when I think about the results that we were able to attain through something, again, as simple as cheerleading, that's what I've always kept in my mind and my heart. And this was early 2000s when I was here. And so transforming now to being a superintendent and then being president of the United Way and thinking about how our communities have to come together. Nelson Mandela has a quote. You can tell how the way a country feels about its children, you can tell what a country believes by the way it treats its children. And I think, the fact that we don't have a funding stream for after school is really telling. In the state of Wisconsin, recreation is one of its core values, and so there was something created called Fund 80 that was extension funding that gave school districts the ability to levy taxes outside of the revenue limit. And that's how we were able to create so much change when I was superintendent there for 4 years. And these are issues of equity. When you talk about driver's license attainment, we had an incident of civil unrest where the community came together, and at the heart of it, it was around our youth and asking them, what do you need? And they told us, we have to be willing to listen. That's something we don't do when we come together as partners often. We have to listen to what our districts and our students are telling us, and they said, we need safe places to gather that are fun, that are places where we can learn, where we can get these opportunities that you were just talking about in your presentation. And so when I think about the opportunities that we have to be able to come together, we have to ask our districts, and I'm so glad we had an opportunity to listen to Dr. Vitti and the needs that they have in the system and the progress that they've made, but being willing to ask, figure out how we can align our resources once we start to hear what those needs are, not just always coming in with thinking that we have those solutions, but then advocacy is mission critical in the way that we're partnering. And one of the things I'm most proud of in being a part of the United Way is a program that we have called Building Foundations. And it's all around, it's a partnership with Wayne County, but the name on the front's more important than the name on the back. So we don't say, oh, this is a Wayne County United Way thing. It's Building Foundations. And it's a program that's really focused on prevention for youth in the juvenile justice system. And we have to have that attitude. That's got to be our mantra in putting our children first and putting the needs of our communities first, not always the hat that we want to wear as partners if we really want to be able to see the progress that we're looking for. And again, you've heard equity over and over again, and I think really, truly remembering at its heart that these are issues of equity, they are issues of safety, but also inspiration. Again, all these hands went up in the room. Think about the roles that you're in now and the skills that you learned when you were how old? In elementary school, middle school, that you've taken with you all of this time to be able to do the work that you're doing today.
That's great. So do you all see an opportunity for us to bring the powerful new science about the brain research and the fact that young people really do learn all the way up into young adulthood, that these skills are not just malleable but teachable, and the importance that these skills have, not just for sort of future life success, but even for learning, that if we're not creating environments in which young people feel safe and supportive, and that are relationship driven, and environments in which they have opportunities to actually pick things that they want to work on so they can achieve that sense of mastery, that just learning doesn't happen. I mean, how can we use this new science to sort of help you all make your arguments stronger?
I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, as Tonya alluded to before, we have this program at the federal level that funds our programs here, or the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. It has been on the chopping block in the past when budget cuts have been debated in Washington. But one thing that's real positive that we've seen is real strong bipartisan support to continue funding and even slightly increase funding for 21st century community learning centers. And the reason for that is a lot of what you've talked about, is that there is recognition that these programs are important. And I think a lot of the bipartisan support drives from the business community, and the business community recognizing, as your data suggested, that these life skills and the positive attributes that students or young people get from these programs are really what the employers need and what the employers are looking for in applicants as they're searching for employees. And so that's what's really driven a lot of what we see at the federal level. Now it's our job, or what we need to do is to translate that into the state level to make this a priority. But I think we're on the right track to doing so. I think we can easily make that case. Another, I think, real positive of the 21st century model is that it does require a community-based partner. So most of the time what we see in these programs in Michigan is a local Boys and Girls Club or a YMCA partnering with a school district or a school entity to run these programs. And that's not just the school doing it all themselves. It requires this community partnership, which from a legislative standpoint is something that's easier to support a lot of times. And we think we can make the case. The one other thing specific around creating a Michigan program that I think would be helpful is, the 21st century program is dictated by the federal government, so the requirements to be eligible are set by them. Well, we have unique situations. Where the program is geared towards neighborhoods or communities of poverty and other things, but we have unique situations in Michigan that we know of where communities for other reasons may not be eligible to apply for 21st century because some of the criteria that's been set. Well, if we had our own Michigan program, we could adapt those criteria so even more communities would be eligible to apply where we know there is the need and where there isn't, frankly, publicly funded after school or out of school time programs now.
That's great.
So I think about research, and I also think about data and how they come together. And so oftentimes, as educators, we use EdSpeak and people they get turned off. They don't quite understand what we're talking about. But we have real-time data right in front of us. Our state is 41st in literacy, and there are a number of reports that have been coming out, and it's 35th here, 46th here, 40. I mean, there's enough data in front of us that tells us that what we're doing isn't working. And it behooves us to figure out how do we get our arms around, they used to call them soft skills. I really hate that word. They're essential skills, they're life skills, they're the hard skills that you need, the fiber that makes us who we are to be able to be successful. And I believe that if we can start being more proactive with what the data is telling us, and again, figuring out how we bring resources together to start honing in one issue at a time. We're not going to be able to boil the ocean all at once, but again, if we can just take one issue, and just to give something really concrete very quickly, I mentioned driver's license attainment. So at the time, Milwaukee County, 75% of white 18-year-olds had their driver's licenses compared to 18% of African American and Latino 18-year-olds attaining their driver's licenses because that funding had been cut and it had gone away. And so we were able to use extension funding, the community college contributed resources, the city contributed resources. We also had some state dollars that we were able to acquire through our CLCs, and we were able to start building a program called MPS Drives. Now we have 3,000 students a year. They're getting their learner's permits, and they're starting to get their driver's licenses. And you think about, a driver's license, yes, you needed to drive, but you needed to vote. You needed to attain credit. You needed for so many other things than maybe what the little card would suggest. And so I think we have to be willing to take some of these hard facts that are right in front of us, and again, figuring out, look who's in the room, all of these different players who are in the room who can come together and start to really contribute in a way that's going to help us get those results. I've been stopped by so many people, and they're saying, United Way, what are you going to do? We've got all of these jobs available, but people don't have the skills they need. What are you going to do? And I keep saying, okay, what are we going to do? What is our joint strategy going to be to help make the change that we want to see in our community?
That's a powerful example. I love that example of the driver's license. It's just a very simple but powerful example of what happens when we're so focused on sort of academics that we cut critical things out of our formal or informal education system. That means that young people are less ready to take jobs, to be prepared for jobs, to be sustained in those experiences. That would be the same for summer youth employment. There's so many opportunities that we could name. I see we're coming up on the 15-minute mark, so I'm going to ask you one last quick question and then turn to Tonya. one of the things that you mentioned, Matt, is that this is Boys and Girls Clubs, it's the libraries, et cetera, that we need these community partners. And those community partners come in so many different sizes and shapes and stripes and names, often from different systems. What can we do to both appreciate the array of partners, but also bring some logic to it, so this doesn't feel nice but not necessary?
Yeah, well, I think a big part of that is holding them to standards, right, and accountability. And that's one of the benefits of the 21st century model as well, is that there are standards and there is accountability with the program. And because of that, we've seen success. And so, replicating that with state funds is something that we're well positioned to do. And so, you're right. I mean, we do have community partners. And one of the things that's unique about Michigan, I alluded to in my earlier answer, is the differences that we see in our different geographical areas of the state. What works in the UP doesn't work in Southeast Michigan and other areas. But when we're solely dependent, and this is unfortunate reality in a lot of the child advocacy areas that my organization fights in, we're solely dependent on federal funds, then we're solely, required to live by their rules and try to adapt our programs to fit their criteria, which doesn't always work. And so I think the best thing we can do is to invest some state resources to support the libraries, to support the Boys and Girls Clubs and the Ys throughout the state that want to offer these programs. A lot of times are offering these programs on shoestring budgets or not nearly to the success level or to the reach that they want or they know they have and they need in their communities because they are not getting public support. And so, I think that the evidence speaks for itself. We think there's a real opportunity. We think that, even a lot of the political arguments that would be against some of these, something like this, an initiative like this, we can rebut rather easily with this specific situation. So I think that's the biggest way to support these communities is to identify some public resources so that they can do their jobs, what they want to do.
That's great. We've got a couple of minutes if there are questions out in the audience or comments. We'll have a moment of silence.
I see.
Jeanetta's got her hand up.
See one of them.
So thank you for your comments, Jeanette Lilly, the Detroit Parent Network. So we talk about ready students, and then we say ready communities. I think there's an integral part sometimes that we're forgetting when we talk about kids, and that's the parents and the families. Could you please share within the model, one that was being spoken of, in what ways were parents engaged in some kind of way as being central to impacting the ongoing development of children? So that's one question. And as we think about the 21st century model, in most cases, it is very child-focused. Could you talk a little bit about where there are some other places that there's been a very intentional focus on engaging and developing parents so they in turn can support their children and move us all to the level that we want all of our children to thrive?
Good. I'm going to give you a very quick reading recommendation. It's a fun read. It's a book called Wildflowers, A Superintendent's Challenge to America, written by Jonathan Raymond, former superintendent of Sacramento Public Schools. And he started really with that question: how do we make sure we have families doing everything that we can to support families being engaged? And one of the first things that he did when he walked into the schools was to say, our schools are not welcoming to families. So they went out, they sent teachers out to talk to families, they made sure that there were welcome centers in every school, mandated that it was at the beginning of at the front of the building, and the first thing that happened was that parents were invited to come into the building with their kids, not leave them on the sidewalk. And you'll read many more examples there, but I'll get a couple of quick answers from you all, and then we'll have another question in the back.
Sure. So I think it's a great question, Jametta, and I think this is a perfect example of what we could do with a state-designed program, right? So the 21st century model is great. It works. We know the needs out there, but it is focused. It's child-focused. It's child-centered because the need is there, and we know, and the criteria, what they're trying to achieve is focused on that, and that's their model. With a Michigan model that we could run parallel with the same administration and other things, we could incentivize, or we could encourage, or we could, even factor in parent engagement and other things into the application process or the criteria for that to better recognize that. Now, that's happening already in a lot of programs, and you know this. I mean, a lot of the YMCAs, a lot of the Boys and Girls Clubs are doing a lot around parent engagement and trying to engage parents. They're not doing that with their 21st century money because they're not allowed to, but they're doing it with whatever other resources they have or funds they they raise, but that's something that we could certainly build into the criteria of a Michigan program.
I would also just add, I think there are a number of different models. So for example, we're working with Pontiac, hopefully being able to launch a community school in Pontiac for the next school year. And that's a model where really it's one-stop shop for families and their children. And so think of having a dental clinic, on-site immunizations for children and their families. There's adult literacy programs, financial literacy, job readiness programs that you can put right into the school where it becomes lighthouse, if you will, of support for a community. But also with United Way, we have programs for early childhood as well as programs for workforce development. And so we were just given a grant from the state where we're the lead agency for Southeastern Michigan now in coordinating the early childhood support network. But we tie that to our Access for All program and to our workforce development programs because many of the parents that are in our workforce development programs also have children that are in the early childhood programs, children that are in the schools. And so this is where we have to connect the dots and sometimes take a step back from our approaches where we tend to silo all of our different contributions in our programs and thinking about how we can integrate those systems a lot better to make sure that we're meeting the needs of children as well as their families, because that's when you really start to see the change.
Okay. Back to the room.
Hi, my name is Michael Williams, and I'm president of Origins Children's Services. I think a couple of things that I would like to emphasize. I think we need to quit saying after school as much as we need to say community building programs, because there's a narrowness when you talk about school for 6.5, 7 months, but these children need to be learning all year round. The other challenge I say, it takes a village to raise a child, but how do you raise the village? And I think that's the challenge that we're faced with. We service children 24/7, and constantly, because we're a child welfare agency, people think that we're only working with poor kids who have been pulled away from home. We have more resources if we use them in a productive way, and I think the gentleman spoke to that. We get state funding, we get federal funding, but we also have philanthropic opportunities that we're missing, because when we say, I got a grant, well, what does that mean in terms of community building? And I think we're looking at how do we connect on a 24/7 basis with the workers we already have to build a community. So I'd just like to get your feelings about how do we become the village that raises the children versus saying that it takes a village to raise a child. Put more responsibility on the village and less on the children, because the drug world did a very good job of recruiting our kids. And we need to understand that. And they come to the child. And so we got a 24-hour service 24/7 hour service that we're not maximizing because we're already in place, and it wasn't cost a lot more to service these children in a productive manner.
So if I could give a previous example, because I think it's something that's very vivid that everyone can really get their arms around. This was August 2016 in Milwaukee. There was civil unrest. Police officers shot an unarmed black man. Actually, both of the men were black. Both of them were Milwaukee Public School students or graduates. And the narrative was the city's on fire. Those MPS kids are out of control. And it was in a neighborhood that happened to be one of the most diverse historic neighborhoods in the city, Sherman Park, and one of the few places in Milwaukee that was actually integrated. I hate to use that term, but that was the reality. But the narrative that was put out was, these kids are out of control, the north side is on fire. And the first step that we had to take as a school district and as a community was to start to ask the people who live there every day, who live there peacefully for decades, what is it that we can do, not only to make sure that this doesn't happen again, but to make sure that we can bring that feeling of community back. And we listened to what they said. It started with our kids. They said, we need safe places to gather. And talking to the community, they said, that's great that you showed up, that there's been a crisis, but are you going to come back tomorrow? Are you going to come back the next day? And so with the churches, Boys and Girls Clubs, our community foundations, everyone, it was the gut check that you never want to happen in your city, but it was the realization that we had been going about a lot of this the wrong way and thinking that if we just had a handful of these staple programs that we would be able to solve all of our community's problems. That was not the case. But it shook us in a way where we were able to put the egos at the door and start to really put building blocks together how we were going to rebuild our community. I remember the GE community, GE Healthcare had this citywide community day. They did it every year where they came and they renovated buildings, they painted, they did landscaping in schools in Milwaukee and Waukesha. And that was the week after, so the incident occurred on Saturday and Sunday, and they came that Wednesday, I believe, and they almost didn't come because the school that they were assigned to come to was across the street from the gas station that had burned down. But they showed up. They showed up. And, we had a moment of silence, and, there were people who were scared, there were people who were confused, but it forced a very different kind of conversation, because you're not just planting some trees, you're not just painting, you're rebuilding a community. And they need to see that people still care about what's happening here. So I really do think that it's incumbent upon all of us to figure out how we do that. We have to check your egos at the door. We've got to figure out how we align these different resources. And I'm glad that we have so many foundations that are sponsoring these events, but it's what we do after here that really matters, because that's what our community is expecting us to do. So, even as I stand here and talking about the, great work that we're doing with United Way, we could all do that. But it really is, how are we going to partner together and bring these resources, but starting with the children and their families. And Jametta, I'm glad you asked your question, because we don't ask them enough. We tend to think we have the answers and say, here, go do this. But we have to take that step back and really be willing to ask those tough questions, because I don't want us brought to our knees because of an incident of that nature. The city has been through that before, and I want us to be able to do that, because we know it works well for kids. We know what experience has helped us get to the place where we are today, and that's the assurance that we are here to give and provide to our community.
I think I'm going to check quick. One more question? Right here. All right. I know where you are. I was just checking to make sure we have time to do it. Yes.
I'm Barry Ford, president of Council for Strong America. Thank you for the presentation. It's incredibly important. What I'd like to ask each of you is, what's the advocacy effort at the state level to get the new resources at the state level to make this happen? I mean, what's the campaign like? How are you organizing? How are you involving communities?
Sure. So I'll start. So the Michigan Afterschool Partnership, is MASP, is our Mott-funded organization that kind of advocates on behalf, generally, of after-school programming. Back to the previous question for a while, we've also, from a messaging standpoint, struggled with after-school, summer learning, expanded learning opportunities, I think, is the best that we've come up with from a messaging standpoint, but it's a challenge. There is a broad advocacy effort underway right now specific to what I talked about these funds. This is a kind of a unique, from a traditional advocacy effort, it's kind of unique when we're talking about legislation that's still working its way through, and it's not where we typically would go and argue in front of the budget committee and say we need this, the appropriations committee, we need this for after school. This is more of an inside baseball decision, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring it up at this group, because a lot of the influence makers are in this room or at this conference, but the legislature and this administration will be deciding where those funds go, and I know there's a lot of interest in passing the legislation. I fully expect the legislation to pass, and so there is a real opportunity. It's a bit of an inside baseball game at this point, but we're ready to go much broader in public with it as the process kind of plays out here.
So our advocacy work is really rooted in a study that's been ongoing since 2010 called ALICE. It's Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. So it's a study that's really focused on our working poor and households that are unable to meet their most basic needs. So in our state, that number continues to grow. In 2 years, it went from 40%, now we're at 43% as a state of our households that are unable to meet their basic needs. That includes education, that includes childcare and transportation and housing, technology, and taxes, and so and health. And so when we talk about advocacy for the whole child and their families, all of those different elements have to be in play. This is an issue that is affecting our entire community, and I heard it in the previous session. This isn't just a Detroit problem or a Pontiac problem. This is an issue that's affecting our entire state, and we have a large number of communities right in our region that are impacted by abject levels of poverty. diversity. And so when we talk about the needs, and this is where the research comes in, and talking about early childhood, the affordability of child care, and also those who are providing those services, that really is anchored in our advocacy efforts around out of school time. That's what I use, but I've been told it's Ed Speak, so I try to find another way. But again, these are issues when you talk the safety net, how we keep our children safe, how we make sure that they have that passport to a brighter future. It really does start with those experiences that help make sure that they're well-rounded. And so again, our advocacy is really rooted around this ALICE study, but it really paints the narrative of the why and how all of these different factors that are impacting families on a daily basis have to be working. We've got to be supporting them with some kind of synchronization if we're going to be able to provide our children with the educational experience that they deserve.
Wonderful. And I think across the country, we're seeing that advocacy efforts are doing the kind of things you said, really trying to connect the dots between things that support children, things that support families, things that address income, focusing on where we really can put dollars into programs and organizations that really sort of can help the community knit things together, but recognizing, as was said in the back, young people don't grow up in programs, they grow up in communities. So how do we connect the dots between those? So with that, I'm going to thank you all for joining us on this brief panel and turn it back over to Tonya.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. I wanted to just say a couple things to also set the context around this, is that after-school programming is a no-brainer. I mean, it really is. When we asked people in Southeast Michigan whether or not they thought that as a state or as a region that we really should support after-school programming, 72% of voters said absolutely yes. The challenge is that when I've talked to people about this issue and I'd say, why haven't we done this? What they say is that there hasn't ever been political will to push this. Because when we look to our politicians, they have political will to push other issues. So it might be economic development, it might be things that are related to land, it might be related to funding of systems. And it's not that they disagree, they all believe that this is an important issue. But who steps out there and says, I'm going to work on behalf of kids, and this is so important, we need to get it done? Well, sometimes they will come along, and sometimes they will lead. But one of the things that I found is that the best of our leaders sometimes need a little bit of a push. And we, I think, as a community, have to mobilize and push. We have to be courageous in this moment and say that if our city, if our state is going to recover, it's going to recover because our children are doing well, and that it will be sustainable and it will be a resilient recovery, and a recovery for all, not just for some. So I just want to share that with you, and then I also want to just make a couple other quick notes. Our after-school system, if you want to call it a system, is extraordinarily fragile. What we found is that the nonprofit organizations that are running these programs, you know, as my grandmother would say, by hook or crook. Like whatever it takes, they're doing it to put the care of meaningful adults in the lives of children. It really does require more than that. We can't leave this to chance. And particularly, I'll just give you one quick thing. In Detroit, we know that 60% of the kids live in poverty. 60%. You heard me. Worse than rural Mississippi. All right? If 60% of kids that live in poverty are in Detroit, and we also know that 80% of them live in concentrated poverty. So that means that the kids who aren't even poor, they live in environments that are poor, and as a result of that, they have the same outcomes as their peers. Do we think a school day is going to resolve this problem for us? No. Learning happens after the bell rings too. And we have to make sure that we really wrap our arms around them if we really want to change the trajectory of our city and the trajectory of our kids so that they can prosper. So I just want to thank our panelists for this. I want to thank all of you for your interest. So as you go around today, tell them after school matters. And if you talk to a legislator, say to them, are you talking about when are you going to support the gambling?
Online sports betting.
Online, whatever. Say it again, because I don't have the right language.
Yeah,
say it.
They know. Yeah,
What should
they'll
they
get
say?
it.
What should they
Online
say?
gambling. Online sports
gambling.
betting.
Make sure it goes to after-school programming, right?
Sure.
And if you see our electeds, tell them, we need your political will on this topic. We need your political will to support our children.